Every empire looks unbreakable, right up until the moment it isn't. And in the summer of 2026, the empire of artificial intelligence cracked in 3 different places, all at once. First, a titan accused its own rival of stealing its most guarded secrets. Then, the smartest minds on Earth were bought and traded like prized trophies. And finally, in the dark, hackers turned a friendly little chatbot into a weapon. This is the story of one extraordinary stretch of month when Silicon Valley's shining machine showed its cracks. A story of betrayal between former colleagues, a bidding war for brilliance, and a breach nobody saw coming. 3 separate fires, burning at the very same time. One single, uncomfortable question rising from all of them. Who can you actually trust in an industry racing this fast, for stakes this enormous? Let's begin where the first crack opened, inside the quiet, guarded fortress of Apple. To understand why any of this happened, you first have to understand the size of the prize. By 2026, artificial intelligence was no longer just software. It was the most valuable race in human history. Trillions of dollars were being poured into data centers, chips, and the engineers who could make the machines think. Every major company on Earth wanted the same thing: to own the mind behind the next great leap. And when the stakes climb that high, the old rules of business politeness tend to disappear. Loyalty bent, friendships strained, and the world's biggest companies started eyeing each other like rivals at war. It was in this pressure cooker summer that the first crack appeared, and it began with Apple. For years, Apple had worked in near-total secrecy on its own artificial intelligence. Behind its famously quiet walls, engineers labored on a dream, an AI as elegant as an iPhone. But somehow, no matter how hard they pushed, Apple's AI never quite caught up to the giants racing ahead. Meanwhile, one address away, a very different company was pulling further and further ahead. Its name was OpenAI, and it was hungry for exactly the kind of talent Apple had spent decades training. One by one, Apple's brightest engineers began quietly slipping out the back door. They weren't heading to Google or Samsung or Microsoft. They were all heading to the exact same place. At first, it was just a trickle. A handful of names, quietly crossed off an internal list, nothing to truly panic over. But the trickle did not stay a trickle for long. 10 departures became 50, 50 became 100, and still the names kept coming. Engineers who had built Apple's most secret projects were suddenly building someone else's dream instead. By the summer of 2026, the number had become almost unbelievable. More than 400 former Apple employees were now building artificial intelligence for OpenAI. 400 people, 400 minds who had once sworn loyalty to a different logo entirely. Inside Apple's glass headquarters, quiet concern hardened into something colder and far more serious. This was no longer just talent moving on. To Apple's leadership, this looked like something else entirely. It looked to them like a deliberate and calculated raid. And Apple, a company that almost never sues anyone, decided it was finally time to fight back. On July the 11th, 2026, Apple filed a lawsuit in a federal court in Northern California. It was not a small dispute over a broken contract. It was a formal accusation of corporate espionage. The claim was explosive, that departing engineers had carried Apple's most guarded trade secrets out with them, not on stolen laptops or hidden drives, simply carried quietly inside their own memories. Apple's lawyers pointed straight at those 400 former employees as living, breathing evidence. To Apple, this was not career growth. This was theft, dressed up in a very fashionable disguise. OpenAI's response was swift, and it was blunt. The claims, it said, were simply baseless. People are free to change jobs, OpenAI argued. Genius does not belong to any one company forever. Some called it simply a giant, frightened of finally losing a race it once assumed it would win. But baseless or not, the lawsuit sent a shockwave rippling through every boardroom in Silicon Valley. Because if Apple could sue over the simple act of people leaving, then any company suddenly could be next. Lawyers across the industry began quietly rewriting contracts, adding sharper teeth to every non-disclosure clause. Recruiters began asking new, uncomfortable questions in every single interview. Where exactly did your last idea come from? The message underneath it all was unmistakable, and it chilled the entire industry. A brilliant mind was no longer just an employee anymore. It had quietly become a weapon and a liability. Some engineers grew afraid to even talk about their old jobs, in case a single sentence became evidence. Apple had drawn a line in the sand, and nowhere was that line about to be tested harder than in the second crack of that summer. Because while Apple was fighting to keep its people, another company was busy buying the very best ones alive. Its name was Anthropic, the maker of the Claude family of artificial intelligence. And through 2026, it had quietly become the single most aggressive recruiter in the entire industry. Its targets were not ordinary engineers, fresh out of university, hungry for their first big break. Its targets were the rarest minds on the entire planet, people who came along maybe once in a generation. And one by one, through 2026, Anthropic began pulling them quietly and deliberately into its orbit. This was not luck. This was a strategy built with the same precision as any great military campaign. And it began with a name that anyone inside artificial intelligence would instantly recognize. The first great trophy was Andrej Karpathy, once the mastermind behind Tesla's dream of a self-driving car. He had left Tesla years earlier to build something entirely his own, far from any corporate umbrella. Now, Anthropic reached out and quietly pulled him back into its gravity. Next came Tom Blomfield, the founder who had built one of Britain's boldest digital banks from nothing. He understood something few engineers ever truly learn: how to build trust at massive scale from strangers. That skill, in the age of artificial intelligence, had suddenly become priceless. And then came the biggest trophy of all. John Jumper, a Nobel Prize winner, poached straight out of Google's deep mind. A Nobel laureate, walking away from the very laboratory that had helped make him a legend. 3 names, 3 completely different worlds. Cars, banking, biology, all converging on one single company. So why would people at the very top of their fields walk away from empires they had helped build? For some, it was simple curiosity, the pull of an entirely new frontier, waiting just past the horizon. For others, it was mission, a belief that this particular company was building something that truly mattered. And for nearly everyone, if we are honest, it was also about the staggering size of the offer. Salaries that once sounded absurd, millions, then tens of millions, had quietly become almost ordinary. Some of the biggest offers reportedly reached into the hundreds of millions of dollars for a single mind. Companies were no longer simply hiring people. They were hoarding genius, the way kings once hoarded gold, because everyone understood the brutal new math of this race. One great mind could outweigh an entire army of ordinary ones. None of this happened out in the open. Behind closed doors, a fierce bidding war was raging. Rival labs scrambled to match every offer, terrified of losing their own best people to the same current. Recruiters who once sold stock options and free lunches now spoke a completely different language. The language of legacy, of history, of being remembered as the person who helped build the future. Every company understood the stakes now. Whoever hoarded the smartest minds would win the entire race. This was the second crack of that extraordinary season. Not a courtroom, but a quiet, ruthless auction of human genius. And while 2 titans wrestled over minds, a third crisis was already unfolding somewhere far darker. Over at Meta, a friendly little artificial intelligence chatbot had one simple, humble job. It answered customer questions. It helped people recover locked accounts. Millions trusted it completely, without a second thought. It felt small, harmless, the kind of quiet tool nobody ever imagines could become dangerous. But somewhere deep inside its code, a hidden flaw was quietly waiting to be found. And sometime between April and June of 2026, in the shadows, someone finally found it. They discovered that this helpful little chatbot could be tricked into becoming something else entirely. A master key, one capable of quietly slipping past the locks on real human accounts. And once the hackers had that key, they used it again, and again, and again. By the time anyone truly noticed, the damage had already spread far wider than anyone imagined. The target this time was not a company's secret code. It was ordinary people's ordinary lives. Photos, messages, years of memories, all sitting quietly behind a lock that no longer actually held. Account after account slipped from its rightful owner into the hands of complete strangers. By the final count, more than 20,000 Instagram accounts had been silently hijacked. 20,000 people who had done absolutely nothing wrong, suddenly locked out of their own digital lives. And the tool that betrayed them was the very same one built specifically to help them. For a company that prided itself on connecting billions of people, this was a deeply painful irony. And somewhere inside Meta's headquarters, alarms were finally, urgently, beginning to sound. On June the 1st, 2026, Meta's security team finally grasped the full scale of the disaster. There was no time for careful, quiet planning, only for speed. Engineers rushed out an emergency patch, working straight through the night to seal the breach. For one brief, hopeful moment, it looked like the bleeding had finally stopped. Then, in less than 24 hours, the hackers found a way straight through the very same patch. The wound was still open, and every single hour it cost Meta far more trust than money could ever measure. Executives faced an impossible choice: keep patching a leaking system or shut the whole thing down. On June the 5th, 2026, they made the only choice that truly made sense anymore. They pulled the plug completely and shut the chatbot down for good. A tool built to make life just a little easier had become the very reason people stopped feeling safe. 20,000 people had to rebuild what they had lost, one careful, painful step at a time. And across the wider industry, a quiet, uncomfortable question began spreading far beyond Meta's walls. If a chatbot built by one of the richest companies on Earth could fail this badly, what about everyone else's? Every AI assistant, every helpful little digital voice, suddenly looked just a little less innocent than before. Because the very same intelligence built to serve us can, in the wrong hands, just as easily be turned against us. This was the third crack of that extraordinary season. Quiet, technical, and yet deeply, personally human. Three very different stories. A lawsuit, a bidding war, a breach in the dark. But underneath, all three were really about the exact same fragile thing: trust. Apple no longer fully trusted the people. It had spent years training and mentoring. Every AI company suddenly had to ask whether its own smartest minds might walk out the door tomorrow. And millions of ordinary people had to ask whether the friendly chatbot helping them was truly, actually safe. This is the uncomfortable truth sitting at the heart of the entire AI age we now live in. The technology is racing forward far faster than our trust in it can possibly keep up. Every breakthrough creates a new fracture somewhere else. Every fortune creates a new temptation. Every shortcut creates a new risk. In one single extraordinary season, three of the world's most powerful companies learned that lesson all at once. Apple, wounded by what it called betrayal. Anthropic, victorious in its hunt for genius. Meta, humbled by a breach it never saw coming. Three completely different endings, arriving in the very same season, inside the very same restless industry. And somewhere tonight, in a glass office lit only by a single glowing screen, the next crack is probably already forming. Because in this industry, the great machine never really stops moving. It only pauses long enough to catch its breath. This has been the story of one extraordinary season in the race for artificial intelligence. If this story kept you company for a little while, consider staying a moment longer and subscribing for the next one. And if you have a thought on which of these three companies you trust the least, I'd love to hear it in the comments below. And in an industry moving this fast, you can be certain of exactly one thing: there will always be another crack coming.